The Omega Protocol Ultimate. Fight's been out for a little while, but my group finally managed to clear it a couple of days ago. So today I just kind of want to talk about the fight in general, how it kind of was for my group prog-wise, kind of like the thematic of the fight, talk about the mechanics a little bit, how we ended up solving some of the problems that we had with the new mechanic style, I guess you could call it, because the mechanics are designed a little bit differently than the usual Final Fantasy mechanics, which I'll talk about that a bit as well. And then also the third-party tools that are kind of going rampant at the moment as well, that make some parts of the fight quite easy when they are really difficult when you're trying to do it legit. So I've got a couple of bullet points written down to kind of hopefully keep me on track, because I didn't write a script for this one, just kind of wanna do it as I go, but I've got some bullet points to kind of try and keep me on track, and if I remember, then I'll also put some timestamps in the description so that you can jump to whatever topic interests you most if you don't want to see the whole video. If I forget to do that, then feel free to shout at me in the comments, and then I'll fix that right away. So when it came down to our prog, probably want to say that this is the worst prog that I have ever had in Final Fantasy. Not per se in the fact that the fight was so difficult that it was just a really bad prog experience, but more so that my group just played incredibly inconsistently. I think the only other prog that was this difficult for me was when UCOP first released, but that was also kind of like a step up from we've never had an ultimate difficulty fight in the game, and now players all of a sudden need to get better at the game in order to clear it. But the thing is, in terms of time commitment, I feel like this fight top took longer to clear in terms of like the fight coming out and us getting the clear, but with UCOP, while we took, I think it's like 2 weeks less to clear it, we did raid a whole lot more, because we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with going casual for this ultimate. And that means that you don't raid as much as you would like to, and when you have longer periods of time between raid sessions, deprog is a thing, and you have to like reprog a part of the fight whenever you do get back to it. And for some players that's not really a problem, like you take a break for a couple days, you come back to it, you take like a pull or two to get back into the swing of things, and you're good to go for the rest of the night. But we definitely had a couple of raid nights where the entirety of the night was spent reprogging the fight to get back to our prog point, and that was definitely very painful. So the next ultimate that comes out, if I do end up doing it, I don't really want to do it on a casual schedule again, because I feel like we quote-unquote wasted a lot of time just reprogging the fight after like a 4 or 5 day break, because we were only raiding 2 to 3 days a week. So that's definitely something going forward. That was kind of like a learning experience there. But in general, I feel like we didn't really play that well either. Over the entirety of the prog, it kind of gave me PTSD vibes from T, because T was very bad prog for my group as well. And it was basically really bad until we got up to like past Wormhole, I think. And then for some reason, once we got past Wormhole, a flip switched and we started playing really well, and we cleared soon after. So it was like 4 weeks, I think it was, of really bad prog, and then 1 week where we just played like maniacs and we cleared the fight. And with top it was kind of similar. For the first 2 months, I think we cleared it in 3 months now. Maybe my time is a little bit different on this, or like wrong, but at least it kind of feels like that. So for the first 2 months, we kind of played really bad. Then we hit phase 5 and we started playing really well for 2 weeks. And then again for the last week or two, we played really bad again. And it kind of felt like we were kind of psyching ourselves out, stressing ourselves out to try and get the clear. And that reflected in people's gameplay. Because for those that don't know, the evening that we ended up clearing the fight was the last evening that we had before we were kind of forced to take a break from the game, because one of our players was going on a vacation for 2 weeks. So everybody was kind of stressing themselves out to clear the fight before that person went on their holidays, so that we wouldn't be left with this 2-week break to then having to reprog and then trying to clear the fight before the next Savage tier comes out, because that's only like a month away at this point as well, I believe, or like maybe 6 weeks, not 100% sure on that. But yeah, like Savage is getting closer, we weren't done with Ultimate yet, we forced to take a break, reprog is gonna happen after that break, guaranteed. So that's kind of like why people were stressing themselves out, I think, and that really reflected in the play. And then of course, if you have a bad evening, brings down the morale, bad morale makes you maybe play bad in the next raid session as well, and it just kind of escalated from there. So Prog experience kinda bad. I feel like most of it has to do with like playing casually, so we had like a lot of time where people got rusty and we had to like kind of get rid of the rust in maybe sometimes even an entire raid night, which kind of contributed to the bad feeling that I had overall. When it came down to P5, kind of proud of my group that we were able to get through it as fast as we did, although as I'll talk about later, there's also a big reason as to why we were able to get past it as fast as we did. Talking about the fight itself then, the main thematic of the fight is randomness. Now, we have had randomness before, mainly looking towards the Dragonsong surprise there, because in that fight, pretty much every mechanic in the game is fully random. Now, what do I mean with that? Well, when it comes down to trying to solve a mechanic in the game, you're usually doing it based on rolls. Whenever there's a stack marker in the game, or let's say we have 2 stack markers, right? The first thing that we look at is that going to be on both of the healers? Because that's something that's very common, and then you make 2 light parties. One goes with one healer, one goes with the other. If it's not on the 2 healers, then it's highly likely that the stacks are going to be, one is going to be on a random DPS, one is going to be on a random tank or healer. So you again have your very clear distinction between your 2 groups, and it's like semi-randomness. Now, when it came down to the Omega Protocol, everything is fully random, so it doesn't matter what role you are. In certain cases, it doesn't even matter what debuffs you have. You're gonna have to look into the party list and figure out what your role in the mechanic is going to be. And I feel like that is where the main difficulty spike in this fight comes from, and is also why certain third-party tools can make this difficulty completely irrelevant, because it will solve the mechanics for you and give you a marker. There are a few ways how we managed to get around this, and I'll talk about those when we get to it. So, in certain cases of the fight, this fully randomness doesn't really matter too much in terms of how you solve the mechanics, because it's literally just, you get a debuff, you look at who your partner is with the same debuff, and you do the mechanic. In other parts, because like for example the very first mechanic that happens, it doesn't matter who you're partnered with, as long as you know who your partner is, you can just play out the mechanic like normal. You get number 3, you know what needs to happen as number 3. When it comes down to the second mechanic of phase 1 though, that is where adjustments need to happen, because you have your 2 light party groups, one left, one right, and depending on who you are partnered with, if it's someone from the same group, you need to make adjustments. So you can start off with your light party groups, but you might have to switch people in those light party groups depending on what number you ended up getting for the mechanic. Same thing for the first mechanic in phase 2, and that is like our first big wall, I feel like, during Prog, because there's so much going on there. You need to see if it's close or far. You need to see if you need to adjust group, yes or no. If you're adjusting group, you're also adjusting lineup, because if it's the far pattern, you need to flip one of the 2 sides. And you then also need to do a very quick dodge of what the save spots are going to be for the MNF mechanic. Now, luckily enough, we were kind of able to do a divide and conquer strategy for the majority of mechanics where we struggled with. For example, for this first mechanic of phase 2, I am a healer, and the healers were, or at least we started off with the healers being the non-adjusting players. They were the highest in priority. Because like for example with Panto Creator, you want one healer on each side to heal that group, so that's why we got the highest priority, and we kept that going into phase 2 as well. Now, because I don't have to care about looking if I need to adjust groups, yes or no, it was my job to call out close far, so players didn't have to look at their debuff, and to also call out the save spots, so that they could kind of focus on, do I need to switch groups? If I do have to switch groups, am I flipping my positioning as well for the lineup for the second part of the mechanic? And then for the second part, we also had someone else call out the eye where that one spawned, so players didn't really have to focus too much on that, and they could focus on the adjusting part of the mechanic. Later down the line in P5, we also did something similar to that, but I'll kind of go in chronological order of the fight, as to not make things too weird. Now, when it came down to P3, or more specifically the transition going into phase 3, that is where we kind of hit like our first, how are we going to solve this mechanic? Because we didn't really know how to make it easy to identify whether or not someone had a stack and who was going to be stacking with them. So in phase 3, for those that don't know, you have 2 players with a stack marker, 2 players with no debuff, so they're going to be stacking with the stack marker players, and you have 4 people with a individual AoE. Now initially, if this was for example a Savage fight, it would be incredibly easy to split groups into this, because you would be able to get your tanks and healers on the left, your DPS on the right, because in a normal Savage environment you would have 1 tank and healer with the stack, 1 DPS with the stack, 1 tank and healer with no debuff, 1 DPS with no debuff, and then you had the leftover 2 DPS and tanks and healers have the individual AoEs. That's the initial idea that we had when we were about to make our positionings or our groupings for this mechanic. But then again we found out that it is 100% random. So we came up with the conga line strat, which is just going to be you have priorities going from left to right, depending on who has what debuff, and then the players that are going to be stacking stay north, the players with the individual AoEs run south. That's the first thing that we did there. And for the players with the individual AoEs, this worked out really well, because you just run back, you see 4 players, you're like, okay, I have 2 people on my left, that means that I am going to be the 3rd person in the line, and you go in position for that. However, we ran into the problem that the 4 players that remained on the north side, they know they need to be stacking in 2 different groups, but they don't know who the stack marker has. So if you have 2 players on the left with the stack, and they stack together, well, then they're going to be dying, of course. In the end, we ended up fixing this by having individual macros for all of us with a marker that we could put on top of our heads. So when we had the stack marker, we would push our macro, you see 2 players with a mark on top of their head, and then everybody on the north side knows where they need to go. If you see 2 markers on the same side, you know one has to adjust. If you see no markers on your side, you know that one of you has to adjust to the other side as well, and then that kind of fixed that mechanic. When it comes down to phase 3 itself, again, there is full randomness in this phase, but it kind of works, because it's just like in DSR. Again, that's full randomness there as well, but depending on the debuff that you were given for the mechanic, you know how the entire mechanic is going to be playing out. Phase 4, not really much to it. To the phase is literally just go stand in position, adjust with the stack if needed, and then we get into phase 5. Now phase 5, again, the first mechanic, it's full random what you're going to be getting, but again, depending on your initial starting position for the mechanic is going to be completely playing out for you. So again, thought it was really good mechanic. Not really too much to say about that, but when we go into the second and especially the third trio, that is where things get a little bit more difficult. For the second trio, it's not that hard. It's literally you look in your party list and you have one person call out which 3 players go north, and the players that are going north are the ones with 1 dynamis stack, and that solved that mechanic for you. But when we go into the third trio, that is where we had a lot of difficulties. So the first thing that's happening is you need to do a very tight dodge that has to be done fairly quickly as well. You then need to identify which 2 players are going to be taking the monitors, and my group also did the extra thing of identifying 2 players that were going north and south to bait the far hello world. Now the reason why we did that extra step as well with the hello world is because we kind of struggled to form up a conga line in time and make it to our safe spots before the hello worlds would go off. Luckily enough, we were able to again divide and conquer for this mechanic. We had one of our tanks call out which 2 players were going to get the monitors, and we had another tank mark 2 players with a 1 and a 2 marker to go take the far hello worlds. The reason why this always worked out is because you needed to send players with 2 dynamis stacks to take the monitors, and you can always send 2 players with 1 dynamis stack to go take the hello worlds. So that is why they only had 4 players to look at, and they were always going to be 4 different players, so that's why that strategy worked out for us. But when you're thinking about it, it's kind of difficult because you now have 2 players looking into your party list while then someone else is calling out the dodges that need to happen so that it allows for those other players to focus their attention somewhere else. So that is kind of like where for me the main difficulty of this fight came in, that mechanics needed to be solved whilst you were actually executing the mechanic itself as well. And when it comes down to me personally, I feel like the mechanical theme, I guess you could say, of the Dragonsong's Reprise was a little bit more fun, because I enjoy mechanics that are full random but that have structure in them, where it is You get number 2, this is your job for the mechanic. Or like, for example, Hello World from phase 3, you get your red debuff, you know you need to go stand in a red tower. And then of course, if you have stack or defamation, then you know where you need to position in the tower. And then again, same thing with the tethers. You know which color is going to be the stacks, you know which colors is going to be the defamations, so you know how to position there as well. It's still a fully random mechanic, but you don't need to do too many extra steps of thinking to figure it out. Whereas in something like the third trio, Alpha, Dynamis, Run Dynamis, whatever it's called, there's a lot of extra thinking involved. You need to be like, okay, who has 2 stacks of Dynamis? Who has something else that they might need to do later in this mechanic that gives them a 3rd Dynamis stack? Okay, these 2 players can now go take a monitor. And then the same thing for like the other players of where they're going to be positioning as well to bait the Hello Worlds themselves during part 1 of the mechanic. There's a lot of extra thinking involved while you're also executing the mechanic, and I feel like that was just a little bit too much. Phase 6, not really too much to say, again, is random mechanics, but you could make priorities of where people were going to go, so that phase actually played out quite like a normal Final Fantasy fight. So that then kind of brings me to the third-party tool discussion. A lot of mechanics are difficult to figure out because they need to be figured out on the fly while you are executing a difficult part of the mechanic as well. And something like Auto Marker takes care of everything for you without having to think too much about anything. You see a marker on your head, you know where to go. Now, there are obviously a whole lot of other third-party tools that were used as well, like zoom hacks, things that make the game not even look like Final Fantasy anymore. Like, I've seen some really crazy things out there. But Auto Marker, I feel like, is going to be the third-party tool that is the most prevalent because it completely trivializes Phase 5. Sure, when it comes down to the first trio, you'll still have to do that, but in the second trio, it'll mark 3 people to go north. In the third trio, it'll mark 4 people or maybe even 6 players. And then depending on which marker you were given, you know what mechanic you're going to be taking care of. And I find that to be very unfortunate. And I'm not really blaming the players either. Mechanics that are designed in this way kind of incentivize the use of third-party tools, and I find that very unfortunate. Again, when we look at a fight like DSR that also had fully random mechanics, but that made sense in the randomness, those fights I really enjoy. But a fight like this, it didn't really matter what debuff you specifically had, it mattered what debuffs you had compared to the other players with similar debuffs to you. And it just kind of complicated things quite a bit, which is why we ended up going to the divide and conquer strategy. I am really proud of my static though, like even though our prog was garbage in my opinion, I am really proud of my group that we were able to complete the fight completely without ever having to like use third-party tools to aid us in our prog. And I kind of want to like add an asterisk to that because we did make use of the sim. For those that don't know, there is a website called xivsim.com/top, I believe it is, where you can simulate certain mechanics of the fight. And some people might be like, isn't that something aiding you during prog? And yes, I do agree with that to an extent. But the main reason why I don't really feel like it's cheating like other third-party tools might be, like Auto Marker, is because it's not something that aids you whilst you are doing the fight. It is a practice space, so to speak. Like when it came down to DSR, for example, we would go to the Churning Mists because somewhere in the Churning Mists there is an arena that looks exactly the same as I believe the Double Dragon arena of Phase 6 of DSR. And we would go there, we would give some of our party members like marks on their head with a macro, and then we would like play out the mechanics like that. The sim is kind of that, but a little bit more reliable and in a space that will actually like play out the mechanics for you as well. If you think the sim is cheating, that is a totally fine opinion to have, but in my opinion it's kind of like a gray area. On one hand, it does feel like cheating because you get to practice mechanics without having to reach them in the fight, but on the other hand, it is a thing that is completely separate from the game itself because it's like literally a flash game that you're playing in your browser, so it's not really something that is directly aiding you whilst you are doing the fight. So that's why it's kind of like a gray line to me. If you feel like it's cheating, totally fine to have that opinion. If you feel like it's just something to help you out during Prog, then that is a fine opinion as well. My group decided to make use of it, and I didn't really mind that too much because it wasn't directly aiding us while we were trying to solve the mechanics, kind of like auto marker or something like cactbot would be. So that's kind of like my stance on the third-party tools. Something like the sim I feel is okay to use if you want to do so. Something like auto markers I feel like is something that is very incentivized when you make mechanics like this, but I still wouldn't really want my group to make use of it, and that is also why I am very happy that my group managed to get through the entire fight without having to employ third-party tools like that. But when it comes down to like players doing this in Party Finder, this is basically going to be something mandatory to use over there, because you don't have the divide and conquer strategy that you can employ, kind of like we have for my group, because communication is needed for that. Maybe you can like kind of get around it by like using macros and markers and such, but it is going to make things so much harder than if you can just communicate, or if you just simply use the auto markers tool, which I feel like for Party Finder is pretty much going to be mandatory when players are getting that far or going for clears, which again I feel like is very unfortunate. It's also the main reason why I hope that when they do a next ultimate, that they go back to the style of mechanics like they did in the Dragon Songs Reprise. Again, Dragon Songs Reprise was, when it came out, the hardest ultimate in the game, and the mechanics were really fun. They still had that 100% randomness to them, and it felt really good to execute on them. This fight was a step up from that, because on top of the fully random mechanics, they added like an extra set of randomness into them, which I feel took it a little bit too far, and that is what also just incentivized the use of third-party tools. And if they want to make an ultimate that is even harder than this one, I feel like a lot more players are just going to start using third-party tools even more than they already are. And as Yoshi P said in like their post when they talked about the world's first clear using third-party tools, they were like, well, if people are using third-party tools, why are we even making these difficult fights if they're just going to be using these tools to clear the fights because they just can't do it on their own or something like that? My counterpoint to that would be, why do you design mechanics in such a way that it incentivizes the use of them that much? Because when it comes down to doing these fights individually, you can't. You just can't go into Party Finder without any communication, without any macroing or whatever, to go, I have these debuffs, this is my role in the mechanic, because it doesn't work. You need someone to either mark players or to call things out, because otherwise multiple players could take a specific mechanic and that'll screw things over. So hopefully in the future they go back to the Dragon Songs Reprise style of mechanic making and not something like they did here in Top. Overall, I think the fight was still really cool. They tried to make it even harder than DSR. I'm really glad that my group was able to make it through it. Really proud of my group that we were able to clear it in the end as well, even though again our prog was really bad. But overall, the satisfaction of clearing was definitely there, and I'm looking forward to see what the rest of the Ultimate series might bring going into the future. Not 100% sure yet if I'm going to be doing it, because this Ultimate did take a serious toll on me, but only time will tell for that one. So those are kind of like my thoughts on the fight, how it came to our prog, when it comes down to the fight thematic and the mechanical structure, I guess you could say, as well as some of the third-party tool usage that has been going around. If you have anything that you would like to add to that, then feel free to leave a comment down below. We'd definitely like to read what some of you guys have to say on the fight as well. And yeah, that's gonna do it for me, so I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.